Welcome everyone. I am Dr Sourav Bhattacharjee from the University College Dublin. In this show, I will be inviting different peoples who are experts in their field, and I will be discussing some very important topics relevant for our society and well-being with them. The things that we will be learning or the lessons that will be very interesting and important for us, and I'm sure you are going to relish and cherish all the findings that will come out of this conversation. Today, my first guest is Dr. Alison Stapleton, who is a lecturer in Dublin School of Business. She has recently finished her PhD from University College Dublin in psychology, and I had a lot of discussion with her, and I have learned myself a lot, and there is a lot for you to understand and to share. I'm sure you will like this conversation, so sit back, relax, and let me take you to this journey where I discussed plenty of issues with her. Alison, Dr. Alison Stapleton, listen, welcome. Welcome to this show. I mean, this is the show where I will try, as a host, I will try to get inside the thought process of some of my guests, and I will try to understand or borrow knowledge from their expertise. And my first expert is, of course, you. But I would like to start with trying to understand about your career journey. I mean, you're working so successfully in Dublin Business School of Business School. I know you have been involved with many other important institutions. Your expertise is expanding all the time. So give us a kind of a quick journey because it will be interesting for our younger aspirants who are trying to make a career. What actually takes to reach the stage and the amount of success that you have got so far already in such a young stage? What it takes to make a Dr. Alison Stapleton. Give us a quick journey of your career.
So I did my undergraduate degree, a BA in psychology at University College Dublin. And towards the end of that program, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And I always say that it feels as if I fell into the PhD.
Fell into PhD?
I had a lot of luck.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really lucky to have the supervisor that I had in the final year of my undergrad.
Who was it?
So that was Professor Louise McHugh.
Very renowned, isn't
yes.
it? You are lucky, I would say.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah.
And she kept me on then for the PhD program. And so the topic of my PhD then was youth mental health.
Mental health. That's the topic we are going to discuss a lot today, isn't it?
So the topic of my PhD was youth mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at well-being and rule following and also acceptance and commitment therapy with young people.
Mm-hmm.
And so since then, I've been lecturing in Dublin Business School and Maynooth University. I've also been involved in a range of other collaborative projects, spanning not just youth mental health, but also other areas of psychology. And it's really important for me to be clear about my qualifications.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a PhD in psychology, but it was psychological research. And although I do have experience in applied settings, I'm not a clinical psychologist.
There have been a lot of strands that I have already gathered from what you have said about this entire tapestry of your career. Now, what I would like to know, so you did PhD, right? So what was your bachelor's and master's? What was the timeline, kind of?
I started college in 2015. 2015. And I finished my undergraduate degree in 2018. And then from there, I went into the integrated MLit PhD. So I did not receive a formal master's.
But it was integrated.
It was integrated, but they don't award a master's degree. So you finish, if you stay the full duration and complete the projects, with just the PhD.
Well, that makes sense, I would believe. So when did you finish your PhD?
I had my Viva in 2022.
And you defended successfully, I'm pretty sure, isn't
it?
Good. And then you were working in Dublin Business School.
Yes, and a couple other places as well.
Like Maynooth University?
Yeah.
Any other places?
Smithfield Clinic in Athboy, County Meath.
Again, fantastic place, probably. Yeah.
And then I have some other kind of ongoing contracts. Like I had a research scientist position in UCD for this recent summer. And also then some of the other collaborative projects with international colleagues.
It is so inspiring that you have been able to pull out so many things so far, and you are doing so great. That's a lot, I would say. You study a lot. That's obviously is pretty clear. You're a very good student, studious student, probably. But I mean, a lot of students, even for example in UCD, I think we both are coming from UCD. I'm an employee in UCD, of course. I mean, we both are quite grateful to UCD, isn't it? We're grateful to UCD for giving us this academic environment, ambience. What was the PhD topic? 1 second, it was mental health or youth mental health?
Youth mental health, I would say. And we were looking at it from a very particular perspective. So it was from that stance that acceptance and commitment therapy and relational frame theory would take.
Can you explain me a bit more about this? I mean, about your PhD work? Take your time and explain us, because it's a bit out of my knowledge.
I think one of the most exciting parts of my PhD for me was one of the last studies that we had done. And so for that work, we were working with a clinical population. So we had a group of adolescents who were waiting to receive services for mental health. And we were able to deliver an acceptance and commitment therapy intervention and then track changes at the individual level across time to see if that intervention seemed to be effective.
And what do you mean by intervention? I mean, what was the methodology? I mean, how do you intervene?
Yep. So it was a 10-session group-based acceptance and commitment therapy intervention.
10 sessions.
10 sessions,
okay.
Yeah. And it was 1 session per week for those 10 weeks.
So the study ran for 10 weeks.
10 weeks, and then you had a baseline at the start, and then you had your follow-up period at the end as well.
So what was roughly the total length or the total span?
69 days. And I know it's so precisely because we had to collect data from each of our participants every single day, which meant that I had 10 alarms set in my phone to text each participant their measures so that they could submit them every single day. So for 69 days, I had 10 alarms in my phone.
So you had total 690 alarms set in your mobile phone. Oh, that's a PhD, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, for our new aspirants to PhD, don't get disheartened. This is hard work, but listen, it's very rewarding. But, okay, so you have done this. You were telling to me, I think, before that you also had something called talk therapy. What was it, talk therapy?
So acceptance and commitment therapy could be seen as a type of talk therapy.
So what do? You talk and you counsel something?
So with ACT, they tend to talk about 6 key components of the model that can lead to more well-being, more valued living. So being able to do the things that you want to do, even if unwanted or uncomfortable thoughts and feelings are showing up. So that tends to be the stance that ACT would take. And
do you have a questionnaire for that, or do you have asked questions? Is there a survey, something?
There are measures of the key skills. So the overarching skill that people try to target with acceptance and commitment therapy is called psychological flexibility. It's a really tricky concept to define, I think. And when people are trying to measure it, they do have some self-report measures. But one of the biggest measures that they have is associated with distress, and it's not significantly different from a measure of distress. So it's tricky to measure that acquisition of skill. But the overarching idea is like, look, are you willing to do the things that you want to do, even when you're having thoughts and feelings that you don't want or that you don't like?
So when you're uncomfortable about doing things. Yeah. Well, what was your gross findings, if I may ask? I mean, what is about the efficacy of these type of therapies?
So in the study that I'd mentioned from my PhD, we found that it overall seemed to be effective. So overall, we saw an increase in well-being and an increase in the acquisition of that psychological flexibility skill. But they also were individual variations. So some people
that always has to be individual variation, isn't it?
Of course, humans
we are humans, so we vary.
But like something that they don't tend to look at often in research is like the harm that's incurred from participating in interventions like this. And so
it's a very important topic. Self-harm is also one of my interests as a Samaritan, as a citizen. So tell us more.
Well, in my specific study, we had seen an increase in depression for some participants after they had gone through
This intervention.
The intervention, even though we simultaneously saw an increase in psychological flexibility. So it really speaks to that idea of well-being is not just the absence of distress.
Mhm.
They're two distinct continuums, or you can conceptualize them as, two different things.
Mhm.
And at the same time, it's really important to be aware of the potential for harm when you're delivering those kinds of interventions. I was really lucky in that I did have access to appropriate supervision and
Resources, I believe.
resources, and also people were sitting in on the sessions to make sure that the children had the support that they might have needed. But when you're thinking about scalability of those kinds of interventions and bringing them out further beyond the 10 or so kids that I'd had in my group, it starts to get really tricky, because how can you make sure that those kids are adequately supported and not, suffering harm as a result of participating in those interventions?
I think you are bringing some very, very important and I would say pertinent topics into discussion. Now, first thing, and again, apologies for my naivety. What do you mean by psychological flexibility? That someone is kind of more accepting to different stresses, different fluctuations to different distressing conditions? What does a psychological flexibility actually mean in layman terms? Or if I am trying to understand, what does it mean?
So one of the main ways to think about psychological flexibility involves those 6 key skills that we touched
6 key
on.
skills, okay.
So the first one is acceptance. So it's being able to allow your feelings to be as they are without trying to change them.
Mhm.
So if I'm feeling really anxious and I'm practicing acceptance, I'm not trying to prevent my anxiety.
You're
and
trying to cope better with it.
I'm
or-
just allowing it to be there, because, emotions in theory come and go. And
True.
so as long as I'm not gripping too tightly on them or trying to actively push them away, then they naturally will change. And that's the thinking underlying acceptance as a skill.
What were the other components? You told 6.
Yeah.
And we have discussed 1.
We're going to be here a while, aren't we?
Yeah. We're going to be here.
Diffusion is the next skill.
Diffusion.
Diffusion.
Or diffusion. Yeah.
And that word is supposed to make you think of like defusing a bomb or something like that.
Scary stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, and it can be, right? So the skill of diffusion is about taking a metaphorical step back from thoughts that you might be having.
Mhm.
So if I have a thought like I'm useless or I'm a waste of space, if I'm holding really tightly onto that thought, that's likely to limit me then in what I'm able to do, because I might have other thoughts showing up like, oh, I can't do this because I am useless, or I can't do this because I'm a waste of space.
So even it's kind of ventilating, it's kind of let it go, even if there is a thought, and trying to understand it's not the reality.
So like seeing a thought for what it is, not what it says it is. It's just a thought.
Agreed. Yeah.
And the idea is that the more we try to suppress or get rid of particular thoughts,
Mhm.
the more pervasive that they're likely to be. So the more they're going to
True.
show up.
Mhm.
One of the examples that people tend to give in this context is don't think about a pink elephant. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, you ready? I'm going to ask you to
Sorry.
do this.
Yeah. Explain.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to do this with me.
Okay, great.
So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you, don't think of a pink elephant. Whatever you do not think of a pink elephant.
I'm not succeeding.
Don't think of a pink elephant on a unicycle. Don't think of a pink elephant on a unicycle wearing a top hat. Don't think of it. And if you are thinking, I am not thinking of a pink elephant, that still counts.
I opened my eyes. That's anything that you prohibit someone, there is a tendency to do it more, isn't it?
And there can be. So if we try to push away thoughts that we're having, one outcome is that there's an increase in those thoughts. So the more I try to get rid of a thought like I'm useless, the more likely I am to have that thought. And that's the general thinking when you're practicing that skill of diffusion.
Yeah. Taking lessons from my life, I can say this is so very true. I mean, whenever my parents or my guardians have asked me not to do something, I have always been a rebel and done it. So they should say, or they should prohibit me from doing the opposite to what they actually want. That will send me to the right direction, isn't it? So, yeah, I'm strange. But anyhow, so it's all making sense. So any other components?
So then we have self as context.
Sorry?
It's self as context.
Self as context. Okay. And context of what?
So it's viewing yourself as not equivalent to your thoughts. So you are not your thoughts. You are the person having your thoughts. So your thoughts are a part of you. They are not all of you. So if I have a thought
Interesting, isn't it?
That's different.
This is interesting because now I'm talking to a trained psychologist and I am realizing that despite being an academic, despite being in research, although not in psychology, I have never actually thought like this. I'm not my thoughts. I always learn what my actions are. But it is true, my actions are driven by my thoughts sometimes. If I'm not my thoughts, then I'm not my actions sometimes probably. Isn't it? Because thoughts drive actions.
Well, so you're having your thoughts.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we talk about this concept with young children, because it's quite a tricky concept to wrap our heads around, we give them the metaphor of a narrator. So we might start to ask the kids, have you ever been in a school play? Have you ever watched a play? Do you know what a narrator is? And then the kids might say, oh, it's the person telling the story. And it's like, yeah, our minds are kind of like narrators. And they're telling us stories about who we are or what we think of certain things or our perspectives. And they're just thoughts. It's just the narrator talking.
Just somewhere a cloud is appearing, a kind of a bubble or a fuzzy fog somewhere appearing and then disappearing, isn't it?
Well, you can view your thoughts as clouds, and you're not the clouds, you're the sky. So you're the container
I'm the
of
bigger
those.
template where all these things are getting displayed, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. I'm really started learning a lot. No, it's an honest statement. What else? Listen, I'm sorry for bothering you, but this is getting exciting, and I'm really intrigued.
I will
not start a PhD now in psychology in UCD. I can promise you that. But at least, yeah, it's really something we miss often in open media, like a clear-cut discussion about getting into the real fabric and granular details of how higher research and higher research minds think. So we have discussed kind of 3 components / threads of this entire complexity. What else would you like to highlight?
I might derail us a little bit and say that it's one way of looking at these things. So that tends to be the perspective that I'm coming from. And it's not the only one. And it's not the only one that works for people either. So there were some recent papers looking at the effect of aligning yourself really closely with thoughts that you might see as favorable. So having thoughts like, I am a good person and I am worthy of this. And those thoughts can be beneficial for other people.
So in a way, you are saying sometimes we humans are biased in our thoughts. We try to incline or align ourselves to the thoughts we think we are favorable to us. And what do you mean by favorable?
Well, just thoughts that we might like or want. I don't know if have you come across the concept of positivity or toxic positivity?
Well, I have, but in a kind of more fuzzy way. It's true, I don't have a clear-cut demarcation of these different terms you are introducing me to. Tell us.
Sometimes when people are experiencing distress and they might have a chat with a family member or a friend, and their friend is just like, oh, well, don't be stressed or think positively. If you think positive, you can manifest
My
good
friends
things.
tell me that, yeah.
And I think for some people that can work. And I want to honor that. And at the same time, I think for other people that can be quite harmful. Because,
why?
Well, for example, in my case, if you tell me not to stress, I might be kind of activated and annoyed by that. Because if I could stop stressing, surely I would have by now,
Yeah, and secondly, probably stopping, I'm looking at a layman's perspective. The different things that stress me in everyday's life, including waiting for bus, even the weather that is with this torrential rain in our Ireland. I think the types of stress that we often go through, and even I go through as part of the cohort of civilized of the society, I think it is important to realize that sometimes just stopping to think about will not solve the problem. Problems are solved by actions, probably, and just not to be a jolly good mood, So, yeah, I can agree to that sometimes it can give you a bit of a ventilation of your fury. That's okay, I stop stressing. But it's not always a realistic or practical solution.
And I think the thing I like most about ACT is that you always come back to what seems to work. And so if you're following a thought and that thought leads you to a place that serves you or is benefiting you, yeah, cool, follow that thought. And at other times, if you're following a thought and it's not leading you to that beneficial outcome, don't follow that thought. It's just a thought.
But then say, I'm practicing what you are preaching me. So
Preaching Jesus.
preaching to me, yeah. Now the query is, say, I'm trying to put this into action into my own life. So what you are saying or what the findings of your research are, how do I know that, okay, what I'm following is leading me to a right direction or wrong? What is right and wrong? I find this very difficult to understand in my life.
So one of the other skills that they talk about is values.
Values.
And so when you say it's serving you or not serving you, it is always in the context of your values. So if you follow a thought and it brings you closer towards who and where you want to be, you continue to follow that thought. It is serving you. And if you follow a thought and it does not lead you closer to who and where you want to be, don't follow that thought because it's not useful for you in that context.
Is it easy to know as a human being? I'm talking only from a psychological and probably a bit of a philosophical angle. Is it trivial to know who you are or who you want to become or morph into? Because if you don't know that, you lose the directionality towards right or wrong. So do we always know for sure who we want to become or who we are?
No, I think if we did, life would be a lot easier, wouldn't it?
Yeah. That's the point. Because,
yeah.
I mean, the topics that we are discussing, that what you were saying, it's actually putting me kind of in a place, in a seat where I would like to know more. Because these are issues, and I see that in UCD, I see that because one of the perks of my job is that I deal with young, fresh minds coming out of school, entering university, getting exposed to such a huge world, and internet connection, global connectivity has made things even wider. And UCD campus is already too wide already. It's large. You get exposed to people coming from different cultures, nationalities, different thoughts. So these are issues that I have seen coping out in young people. And you're right, we don't know. That's the question, is we don't know. But so what shall we do?
Well, we don't know and we can't find out. I think there's a couple of key issues that show up in the context of values. And one of them is related to concept of pliance. So I want this thing, but only because you want me to want this thing. So it's
you're
not
under some kind of peer pressure?
Yes, exactly. And so from an ACT perspective, that would not be a true value because it is only being endorsed because you think the other person...
Isn't it?
Well, it could be enforced, but the only reason you're saying it's a value is because you know that that's what the person wants you to say. And so any actions you take that are aligned with that value are more likely to be unfulfilling for you in theory. So actually endorsing those kinds of ply-based values or doing just what other people say to do is less likely to be effective long term.
Very interesting, because when I look around, I see we all are living in a society full of endorsements. I step out of my house, I'm coming here, I'm having this nice conversation with you. I see my face being covered in advertisements. Everyone is asking me to do something or to buy something, eat something, drink something. Is there a way, and I'm asking you not as a trained psychologist, I'm asking you also as a young person with so much of bright career ahead of you. Is there a way we can kind of shield us from this type of sometimes intrusive and unwelcome endorsements?
I don't know if I would pick the word shield, but I think you always have the power to tune back into the things that you personally care about. And at times that can seem really challenging to differentiate from what other people say you should care about. And
it's true. You're making sense, yeah.
And one of the things that we might do is try to alter the support for that kind of behavior. So I'll give you a more concrete example of that. If you bring to mind something that you care about. Now, when I say something, I mean a quality or an ongoing way of being. For example, I'd like to be kind, or I'd like to be assertive. So bring that to mind. And now I'm going to ask you a question. And that question is, if nobody knew that you were that thing, would you still want to be it?
I don't know how to answer it, but
Mm.
I think it depends on individual people, isn't it? Their own psyche, their own setup. People, as you said, we are different. Uh, I, I'm quite lost to give answer to this very difficult question, actually. But I can see that you have engaged with the society and you are engaging with people. You are a lecturer, so you're also dealing with young people a lot. And this is one, as I said, this is one of the perks of our jobs. I mean, what do you see? Just because with your observational skills, I mean, there is a lot of talks and uproar going on about the mental health issues, the suicidal tendencies. That is true. But what I have always found difficult is how do we actually quantify it? Can we quantify it? Can we say, okay, this is the suicidal rate? Because what I have found typically is that people kind of try to not brush it off, but they are kind of more naive and they try to feign kind of an obliviousness. Whereas if they're physically sick, say have a fever or something, they immediately go to their GP, they get into contact with the healthcare system. But when they're coming into, say, for example, there is some kind of mental illness or people are just feeling down, they kind of try to ignore it. My first question is, what is your take on that? That how much of a problem this is? And is it like an iceberg that we see a very small part of it, whereas a huge part is somewhere hidden, lost, I don't know, in a deep, dark fathom? What is your take on that?
That's not a small question at all. I think there's different parts of that question, and one of them relates to measurement. So are we accurately capturing the numbers of people who are genuinely suffering? And it's tricky to know. We do have some statistics that we can look to, and they are not without their flaws. So, for example, in the context of suicide, which you had mentioned, you might have some people deemed not a suicide, even if it actually was. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe there weren't enough clear indicators. But we tend to then look at statistics considered probable suicides in addition to ones that were accurately ruled as such.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really tricky measurement issue. And I think the second part of what you're saying relates to, stigma and marginalization of members of the population based on, supposed mental illnesses. And I think that relates quite a lot to the way that we think and talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
On the way over here, I had a cab driver, and he was he was talking with me about mental health because I mentioned that I was in psychology. I don't tend to do that. I don't know why I did. But
Taxi drivers can be very inquisitive sometimes, and in a
he
good
was
way.
Great. Like
in a good way,
fab.
Yeah.
He was great.
Yeah.
And he was talking with me about mental health, and it's always funny when you see, or I find it funny when you see people talking about mental health and they say things like, yeah, do you know, this person had a bit of the mental health.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I'm not sure that I know what you're intending here, but I'm not sure that this is landing with me in the way that you mean it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a real tendency to frame so many different things as illnesses that aren't such. And just because I'm not saying that something is an illness doesn't mean I'm not recognizing that it can be disabling. Of course it can.
Yeah, of course it can be.
And it's certainly not without its struggles. And at the same time, I'm not sure how helpful it is to frame someone as sick just because they're having a natural response to the situation that they're in. I would have a lot of concerns for someone who's in a crap situation and is not saying that they are anxious and is not saying that they are depressed, for example.
So they're somewhere hiding it inside them.
Well, I would be concerned. Like,
of course, there should be. It's like a hidden. A lot of vapor is getting submitted there. And if you don't let it vent, then there will be catastrophe.
I think the point that I'm making, or what I mean when I say this, is just that I think people are pathologizing normal reactions to situations. When things are going poorly, it makes total sense that someone would be struggling or someone would feel sad or anxious or a whole range of other experiences because the context that they're in is not supporting them flourishing, right? They're in a context that is not good for them. Of course, they're not doing well. And rather than pathologizing the individual, there's a problem with this person, can we instead shift focus to the environment? Like, what in this context is setting the occasion for those responses in that person? Why is this person actually struggling, and can we do something about it? So it's not a broken person.
It's a broken system.
That's impacting a person.
Or
and
a broken environment.
And that person's having a natural response. And I think it's important to be careful with these conversations too, because I do worry that I sound like I'm downplaying the degree of...
No, you're not, yeah.
Well, I'm glad that it's on in that way, and I do want to be explicit about it. But I think people can really, really struggle. And when I frame them as natural responses to the environment that people are in, I certainly don't mean to take away from the extent of that struggling.
Well, I think I can quite candidly agree with you, because I think our environment is somewhere down a matrix, and we are like in this ether, in this environment, whatever way we define it. We are kind of small niggles trying to always adapt. Adaptation is part of life and our evolution. We adapt, and someone who can't disappears or is eliminated from this world. That's adaptation. That's extinction also. Things get extincted, life forms get extincted. So I can totally make sense of that rather than solving the problem, we are often stigmatizing a normal guy. But then again, what is normal? I mean, isn't it always a dilemma to define normalcy? Isn't it? What is your take on that?
I agree.
Yes.
I think I don't like the words normal. I think I have a kind of reaction to them. Because normal...
Again, it's a very commonly used word. Huh?
Yeah, all the time.
All the time. It's pervasive throughout the system, throughout the documents, policy documents. What is normal? And we are typically have seen this bell curves, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But that's a statistical interpretation. But in real life, I agree that normal is probably a difficult term, isn't it? To handle, especially.
I think so. I think I have a lot of reactions to normal. And when I'm having those reactions, it's not that I don't understand what someone is saying to me. I can appreciate that they might be saying, oh, no, this person is normal. They don't have that particular neurotype. I understand what they mean when they say those words. And I'm still concerned about it. Because it's always, supposed normal in the context of what and who deems what's normal. There's been some recent shifts towards different approaches to mental health. And different client presentations, and it's the neurodiversity movement.
Neurodiversity movement.
Yeah, and so that it came out of the autistic advocates movement in the 90s. That was where the initial kind of ideas came from, and then the term was later published by an Australian sociologist.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that just as we have biodiversity, we also have neurodiversity. So everyone has a different brain, based on the stuff that they inherited and were born with, and also based on the experiences that they've had. And so when we talk about neurodiversity, we recognize that there is such a thing as a neurotypical brain. There is a norm, which is constructed by the society that people are in. And there are people who differ from that neurotypical brain. And some people who differ from that brain have been negatively impacted by the way that the environment is set up.
If not marginalized.
Exactly. So some people are punished more for differing from that norm than others. And that's where we start to talk about the social model of disability. So it's not that you're disabled by your brain. You're disabled by an environment that is inherently inaccessible to you.
It is ostracizing you, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
These are very interesting points.
I feel like I should also maybe say that that's a relatively newer field for me. So I've only been in those spaces maybe 2 years now at this point. And also I'm mindful of you started off the podcast saying expert. I feel like I'm inherently uncomfortable with that term. I'm an expert in the things I know and certainly not the things I don't.
That applies to everyone, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. I think though, I feel a lot of responsibility if I frame myself as a psychologist and then an expert, and then I have takes on things that are opinion-based and based on research that I've interpreted or how I'm understanding things. So I do want to be really clear about that as well.
That's fine, but academic freedom gives us to form our own opinion.
That's contentious though, isn't it?
That's contentious. And listen, I mean, that's part of becoming or evolving into an independent researcher. That is why we have perspectives, and we agree to disagree. That should have been the case. That often is the case. That we agree to disagree. There will be countering arguments. Some people might think separately or differently than what you are, or even I am thinking. But I think, as an anatomist, as an anatomy professor, I can say I totally can make our understanding of this point, of this neurodiversity, because I have taught head and neck systems to students. I understand how little I understand about brain. It's an endless mystery. And I can completely appreciate if you say there is a diversity within people. And a lot of this diversity has been recently included in academic institutions as part of equality, diversity, and inclusivity movement. I think we should also try to understand of this point of neurodiversity, that by brain, which kind of drives our thought process and tries to makes who we are, there is also diversity. And I think the diversity movement will only get complete when we also try to understand this neurodiversity and try to understand, rather than chastising people by saying abnormal, weird, queer, that they are part of this ecosystem, isn't it? Now, one thing I would like to ask is, you have talked about different therapies. Some you have worked yourself, some you have heard, some you have read. And one interesting point that you made that time, that one of the difficulties, if not the primary difficulty, is of these different studies you have made, is the scalability. How to upscale it? Because I can understand, and this is something I have faced myself as a scientist myself, that you can do a lot of experiments with animals and stuff, but then again, upscaling is always a huge, huge issue, because you are dealing with a completely different beast out there, because there is millions of people out there, and especially in pharmaceutical field where I have been deeply engaging with. I mean, something works in the laboratory because it's a small cohort, but something works in a small cohort doesn't mean you just stretch that cohort and it will automatically fit into the entire population. So, a simple question. Your study was great, you have published it, I'm sure it is well received, but what next? How do we translate this? How will we, if there is one young person, and I'm not even asking young person, anyone, even me, if I want to avail the fruits of this research, fruits of this, what you have done, a lot of positive things to be learned, how do you plan, or how do you think we can spread it across the cross-section of society?
I'm really surprised that you framed that as a simple question. Like, Alison, fix mental health.
Well, at least I'm sure you have an idea.
I have projects I would like to do, and I do not have the resources to do them. I think the problem for me is that I really strongly believe that things have to be done slowly and carefully. And as you said,
especially in mental health, I completely agree. Because people are very vulnerable sometimes.
And
I agree with you.
We're working with children as well, or young people generally. I feel even more strongly about that than I already do. And I think too often people frame mental health interventions as one size fits all. And that is just not, that is not the case.
That's an interesting point, yes.
And that is not what I've observed in my research, and it's not what I've read of other people's research either. And I think there can be a lot of harm done, unintentionally, but still done, when interventions are just rushed out and mass-produced and put into systems without adequate support for the interventions.
And who will provide this support?
That's the question, isn't it? There was
it needs funding, it needs personnel, it needs training, isn't it?
Yep. And there was a recent study, cannot remember the authors, but there was the Myriad trial. Mm-hmm. And their overarching finding that was really big in the field of psychology only recently was that mindfulness did not have any benefits in schools. And so they had this really well-structured...
People didn't like it, isn't it?
Well, there was no improvements until eventually they dug down into the data and they noticed that for teachers who were favourable, I believe it was, towards mindfulness, their students were likely to have those desired changes in mindfulness skills. I think that was the overall finding that I had noticed. And to me, that's really interesting because I think that speaks quite a lot to it's not enough to just give this teacher who's overworked and already underpaid this whole new intervention that they have to learn when it was probably developed by psychologists. And then they're not having access to the support that they would need to run that intervention effectively. It makes sense that they would not occasion changes that we might like to see.
I completely agree. I deal with students. You deal with students. We deal with thousands of students. What I think one thing has very well transpired from the conversation that we had so far, that it's a specialist field. It's not. You can have a conversation with a taxi driver or your neighbor or someone, but we often overlook the intricacies and the expertise that you need to handle that. And often when you are in a teaching slot, you don't have it. So to expect to do something and that will make actually some difference in the ground realities might be too much of too great expectations, isn't it?
I think that's the thing, though. Like, I think a good scientist can take their stuff and make it work for real people. But I think doing that and making it work and getting it into the water supply takes such a significant amount of effort and oversight and supervision and dedication, not only from the researchers, but also the people who are now learning those skills.
It will take a lot of time then. Especially when you are dealing with inflating class sizes. When there is one lecturer and that person is in charge of a lot of things, hell lot of things to be done. This will be quite an workload, which is not easy.
And there's a program in the UK called Connect, PSHE, and they've built an ACT and DNAV, which is just another type of this approach into curriculum and lesson plans. So that is ready to go into the water supply for schools in the UK. And they have some studies showing enormous success with their kids. And I know that they've put a huge amount of time into actually doing that in a way that is sensitive and careful and has supervision and has training for teachers. And still, it's a huge undertaking.
It's a huge undertaking. And I think the health services sector has to come in, which fundamentally means if I understand you well, you want to start employing it even from the early school stage, I believe. When the kids are trained, is there, okay, so even if this huge undertaking is done, but when the child comes back is out of school, and a big part of his or her day is spent outside school sometimes, and there it becomes probably even a bit more difficult because now, at least in school, you have an organization, you have a template, you can reach out to professionals, you can reach out to teachers, you have a human resource probably, and so there is still some kind of a structure which you can exploit. But when it comes to just a society, just families, and you have uttered a very important term, I like the term, that's called values. How do we convince the larger society, the families, the guardians? How do we go to them and inculcate these values inside our education system or the teaching or the lessons that we go beyond school? Is there a way?
I think kids come with families, and so we can build what we can into school systems, and we'd say that we're more likely to see those gains and skills that we want to see if it's also at home with the family. And getting buy-in for that kind of stuff can be really tricky. So oftentimes you're recommended to hinge it on what the family cares about or what the parents care about.
Yes.
If you had one wish for your child, what would that be? And what if these skills were a way to get there? But again, you have to be so careful there because you want to make sure that you're not wasting people's time. Like, is what you're saying accurate and likely to be the case for that particular child, given that we see those individual variations in responses to interventions as well?
I agree with you. It will be quite tricky and I would say even cumbersome. And I think it would be an honest exploration, if it is even feasible, that we somewhere have to find a kind of an integration and interface between education, formal education going in school, and what is happening beyond school. Because what I have found, I believe you will agree, that a lot of our learning goes beyond school in informal setups. So I think it will be really difficult to control and have a more kind of a monitoring, and especially, as we have said, that sometimes, despite good intentions, this might be doing wrong things more than good. So you will be doing probably, or this therapist can have, let's say they have a downside as well, which needs to be talked. There is no magic bullet to solve everything. Are we doing enough as a society, as signatories of human rights? Because I think a healthy world where people are inclusive, people are included, they're not ostracized, they're not marginalized, chastised. It's a right. I think, only speaking on my behalf, I have been through a lot of these things where people just say, you are queer, you're just bizarre, you're just weird. But then again, like we discussed, what is normalcy? And it's probably not an apt term. So how much inclusive shall we go? Because if we include everything, then we will be missing also the pathological cases. So shall we we cannot be totally inclusive, right? Or I'm interpreting it wrong.
I don't know. I don't think I understand what you're saying here.
No, we develop an inclusive model where we understand that people deviate from these typical social prototypes or stereotypes. But then again, everyone is part of this ecosystem. Or how do we diagnose the pathological cases who really needs help? Because someone will say that's inclusive, that's also should be included as normal.
I think, I think I'm understanding now. I think inclusivity is not in conflict with a social model of disability.
Okay. That's where I want to go.
Yeah, and I think I'm having a reaction as well to the word pathological. I think there's a few things that show up for me, and I don't know if we'll cover them all because I have a notoriously bad memory. But there's a few things
I don't agree, but it's okay.
Well, a few things that show up for me. I think when I have in the past asked for people to be careful with language choices or signposted words that I don't think are appropriate, on occasion, people can respond with, political correctness and, who cares? I'm just describing this thing. And it's like, well, the word that you're using is in reference to a person. And that person has to carry that word that you've just put on them. And even in the context of, writing a psychological report after an assessment or an identification with a child, that report is going places. People are going to see that report and the words that you use to describe that child. And that's going to have an impact on the way that they interact with that child. Or at least I think it will. And even in terms of how a child understands themselves, if we're giving kids these big, heavy labels, we need to be aware of what those labels are doing for that kid. And if they're not functioning as a passport to supports, and they're not serving that function of a better understanding of the way that their brain works so they can accommodate it, then I do have an issue with it. And I'm not sure that pathological is a word that provides people access to supports. I think the other thing that shows up there is that when we talk about pathology or these other kinds of words, we're inherently coming from that place of the medical model of disability, where it's a broken person who has an illness.
Physical disability.
Well, it could also apply to neurodevelopmental disability.
Yeah.
It seems to inherently come from that place. And I tend to lean more towards the social model of disability at this point, where people can be disabled by their environments. And it can be a really disabling experience to have a neurodevelopmental disability. So, for example, autism or ADHD. But that doesn't mean that you're ill, you're a sick, broken person, right? You're in a world that was designed for a certain type of brain, and it just so happens that you differ from that. And I think I don't need to frame someone as
diseased or
pathological to give them support.
Yeah. So what I understand, what I have chatted with you so far, that the society also, that's part of an environment, and that's probably more inclusive word, that has a lot of effect on us. And there are two things I see. I mean, you have mentioned that you're absolutely not happy with labeling people.
I love labels, actually. I do. I'm careful. I think that's what's showing up here. Careful labeling. And I think when I'm critical of the way that people might use language, it comes from that place of an awareness around what a label can do. And if the label is not helping someone, it's hurting them.
A lot of times it doesn't. I agree.
And I think even from understanding yourself perspective, I think labels can be enormously helpful. I was recently involved in a systematic review looking at the experience of being identified as autistic late in life.
Mm-hmm.
And those studies were really beautiful and powerful, and they were qualitative, so you could feel the people who were in the papers. And they spoke so much about how being correctly identified as autistic was really meaningful for them. It's like, oh, I'm not a broken neurotypical person, or I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm just different. And it's that different, not deficit, or my brain works this way, therefore a strategy that might help me is this. And I think labels can be really important from that perspective. So it's not that I am against them. I'm just in favor of being careful with the way that we use them. And also honouring that people can have really strong attachments to labels from an identity perspective. And again, that can be enormously useful for them. I'm not... So someone might have an identity of autistic. So I am autistic, and therefore it can benefit me to have these accommodations. Or I am autistic, and therefore it's okay that these things are difficult for me.
You can claim certain support or certain resources, and I think that's fair.
And even understanding or self-compassion, it can be a good segue in. Now, ultimately, it's ideal for people to be compassionate to themselves outside of contingent if-thens. Compassion just because. And I think still labels can be really useful from those perspectives. So passport to support, identity, connection with a community. Look at this other group of people who also have my label, and we can connect and share experiences and swap support ideas. And I think there's a lot of benefits. And if not used cautiously, there can be significant downsides to using labels.
Very interesting points. So, I mean, it's a very spread out discussion now, and it has to be, because mental health is such an issue. We just cannot decide these are the points, check. There are probably no check boxes as such that these are the only framework. The framework is sometimes malleable, sometimes flexible, if I may say, because a lot of things come into there and affect us. Now, I've been chatting to you about the different therapies and your takes on different things, including labeling and pathologizing people, which can be quite, I would say, hurtful. Now, say, coming back to the interventions that we can do in school, or despite it's a huge undertaking, is it probable, improbable, given our current conditions or given the societal framework? That is a different discussion. But say we have a cohort of students and we are doing certain therapies. How would you measure, or how would you ascertain that it is actually doing some benefits? It's a long-term study. It's a very prospective study, I believe. And especially one of the studies you were saying that the statistics, these data sets can be a bit tricky. So there are already some inherent issues methodologically for a long-term cross-sectional study. You have a plan, or I'm sure you would like to do this type of studies in future, pending good funding coming on your way. But what would be your methodology? How would you assess that this is really working? This is just not a schism in somewhere in the Excel sheet. How would you make sure of that?
I think it depends on the kind of intervention. So there's There are different types of interventions that you can roll out, not just in terms of the specific branch of therapy that they're using, but also the groups that you're offering them to. So, for example, a universal intervention could be one that we just build into a school. So it's not a clinical population, it is just the entire class group.
And do you want to do it as part of curriculum?
Well, that's the option. So you could do it that way. And then in terms of measurement, with a non-clinical population or a population that has very few children meeting clinical criteria, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see significant decreases in supposed symptoms like anxiety or depression, because they weren't reporting that at the start. So in those kinds of studies, it seems more beneficial to focus on psychoeducation. So do you understand the concepts that we've covered here? Have you used any of those skills? Maybe some acceptability measures. Did you enjoy taking part in this intervention? Or what would you change about these kinds of interventions going forward? And I think if you're coming at it from a universal perspective, it has to be that kind of psychoeducation as a measure, because we just would not expect to see those decreases in supposed symptoms.
Would you like to include the guardians or the families of the students as part of this feedback mechanism?
Oh yeah, well, I'd love to include everyone, like as many perspectives as possible. But
it's becoming
you have
a
to
huge
weigh
study.
It up, right? You have to weigh it up, and you're taking people's time. Like every participant who gives you data is giving you data and taking the time to do that. And I suppose I do feel a responsibility to that also, because you want to be sure that what you're doing is going to make the best use of the time that they're giving you. So being able to collect really good data that can meaningfully inform not just your work, but also the work of colleagues in the field, and other fields too, like branching out as far as possible, so that those data do have an impact, and the time that people did give you is not going to waste.
Yeah, and I think even that will need some training, because giving feedback is a difficult stuff. It's not easy. Giving feedback and criticizing someone are two different things. And in my experience, I have seen people often don't understand the difference. So it's a huge study. I'm sure you're writing a huge grant.
No.
Best of luck for that.
I just want a job that's permanent and...
Oh, we're back to square one, isn't it? Well, listen, I mean, it has been a very rewarding conversation with you. I have learned a lot. Thanks for enriching me. One last question. We have been discussing mental health, and I think it's very clear. The complexity is huge. And probably there are no easy answers. But if you are in charge of this society, what would be your take? How, say you have all the power in the world.
Oh my God, why?
Just for this podcast,
Okay.
You have all the power.
Christ.
You can change things. People will listen to you. What are the few advices you will give?
Appoint a better leader.
I think if I can sum up to what I have understood with you with this conversation. First of all, thanks a lot again. I mean, it has been an enriching conversation, not only for me, I think for all of our audience. And what I have understood that, of course, mental health is a very difficult matrix, very complex, multidimensional matrix system that we are dealing with. We don't know how far is normalcy. And from after my lesson from you, I will not use the word normalcy many more times. I can promise you that. So I think it's time to call it a day. And listen, this conversation can go on forever. I know, but in view of time, we have to stop somewhere. So, Alison, once again, really thanks a lot for coming over. It has been a great opportunity. And as I said, I have enriched myself, and I'm sure my audience, our audience, will be extremely exhilarated to know a lot of these facts. And I'm sure they will Google you, and who knows, maybe some good emails and inquisitive emails will be coming your way. That's because what we are fundamentally doing is some kind of outreach. And I hope this, our conversation will nourish people. They will understand the complexity, that it's not so easy. And what can I say? I really remain grateful to you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.